whatever system produced multiple decades of snooty academics telling you that their statistical analyses have demonstrated that something self-evidently true to you is false. Whatever system produces that and takes multiple decades to correct does not deserve prestige. It does not deserve credibility. It annihilates its own credibility.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Steve Patterson. Steve is a freelance philosopher. He is a philosopher working outside of traditional academia, and he comes from a very non-traditional education background. He grew up homeschooled. He went to college to get an undergraduate degree, but did not go on to grad school. He went and worked in think tanks instead before beginning his work a decade ago in independent philosophy. In today's episode, we talk about the research that Steve has done over the course of his career. We talk about what it means to be a philosopher and what his day-to-day looks like. And we talk about how over the course of his studying and research, he's come to believe that we're actually in a dark age of philosophy and ideas and information, and that much of what academic institutions have produced over the past century is actually riddled with errors. And we talk about why our institutions of thought and knowledge are often so corrupt and so flawed, and the work that Steve is doing to forward the efforts of independent philosophy, which he believes is a burgeoning field. This was a fascinating and delightful conversation, and I hope you enjoy listening. Steve Patterson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I've wanted to have this conversation for a very long time. One, it's been a while since you and I have caught up, but two, there's so much in the work that you do that is so relevant to the conversations that I have here that we've been talking about this for a while, and I'm very excited that we are finally making it happen. The last time I saw you in person was in Atlanta years ago, I believe.
Yeah, I think so.
And I have a very specific memory, which is you telling us about how you like to take long showers to think, and you had shower whiteboards that you would use to take notes that you would travel with. So that you could use your showers as your big philosophical thinking time. And that made such an impression on me. I remember this years later. I was like, I want to be that cool
Oh my
someday.
gosh, that's so funny.
I remember that
They're called
vividly.
shower notes. Yeah, no, I actually have a drawer in my bathroom still of backup shower notes just in case I run out. So yeah.
That's amazing. Can we talk about this for a second? Because I never asked you questions about it then, and I've been dying to know.
Sure, I didn't realize
since.
I had said that aloud, but yeah, go for it.
How do you use them? What is the process? And is this actually like a core part of your thinking process as you're working through ideas?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, a lot of people report, shower thoughts are the great insights that they get, or weird, like absurd philosophical ones sometimes. And I found that has been the case for me as well. I think fundamentally it's just about blood flow to the brain, if I'm being honest. I just think that when I take a shower, I put it right on the brainstem coming out of the shower head. And that's where I get a bunch of good thinking done, and in the bathtub as well, but I do like the hot showers. And so I realized, in fact, I don't know if I told you this, I might as well tell you this too, because it's an even crazier story. Not only do I have shower notes, which are it's like a waterproof notebook that you can keep in the tub for when inspiration hits. I also, while I was living in South Carolina, I was this is ridiculous to say. I'm already embarrassing myself, but I actually experimented with a keyboard setup. So I got a waterproof keyboard that I hooked up to like an iPad. So I tried typing while I was in the tub. I was trying writing while I was in the bathtub or the shower because I was so into it. That one was a little bit clunky. I never quite got the keyboard didn't work so well, so it was more annoying than anything. But yeah, I'm really into the hot water thing.
That's amazing. This makes a lot of sense to me. I have really great ideas in the shower sometimes too. It's not a consistent thing, but it's like every time I get in the shower, I'm guaranteed to have a good idea.
Yeah.
It tends to come in a flurry, but for some reason, sometimes I'm in the right headspace and I'll have a
Yeah.
bunch of epiphanies. And
Yeah.
so I've definitely been known to stick my hands out of the shower so I can type on my phone to write down ideas. The iPhone says it's relatively waterproof, and I'm definitely banking on that. But this is a much better setup. Is this actually something that you intentionally work into your workflow? Do you have blocks of shower time? No, this is a much more spontaneous thing.
I take showers until I run out of hot water very frequently. And I just have a little shower note thing. It's got 2 suction cups. You put it on the wall, and it's got a pencil on top, and you just write away when you need to. At some point, I'm going to have like a infinite hot water where you don't have a hot water tank. I can't imagine what my utility bills will be when that happens, but fortunately, I'm not there yet. So I have like a cap on the amount of hot water I can go through.
Yeah, the constraint breeds creativity idea. Right. You know the hot water's running out, so you have to be efficient with it.
Right.
That's amazing. So you're a philosopher. And so far, what we know about philosophers is they take notes in the shower. Yeah. I want to dig into what it is that you actually do, because you're a philosopher both in a very traditional sense in historical context, but also a little bit non-traditionally in terms of what people think a contemporary philosopher perhaps is, because you are not an academic in the academia institutional sense of the term. You don't work inside of a university. You're completely independent. What does a philosopher do? What does it mean, the work that you do?
Yeah, well, in my mind, philosophy is just trying to make sense of the world using your reason. So right now in our contemporary zeitgeist, people think like science is the way to understand how the world works. And other people, maybe they'll have an interest in economics. This was something I was particularly interested in. They thought, economics helps you understand how the world works. Some people think it's physics. So just in my research and trying to figure out how the world works and try to understand it more deeply, I've discovered that in every single domain, when you're trying to understand something deeply, it all, without exception, grows out of philosophy. It grows out of philosophical concepts. And my own individual path, it started with an interest in politics when I was young and political theory. And I heard, I was like inspired by the Ron Paul campaign in like 2007 to really start diving into economics because I was interested in politics. And I realized that economics really does it's a more powerful conceptual toolbox for understanding how the world operates. But then I realized as I dove deeper and deeper into economics and Austrian economics, specifically I got into questions about the methodology of economics. Like, how do you do economics? Is it something you just sit and you think about in the shower? Is it something you go out into the world and you run experiments and you say, okay, is it a science? How do you do economics? This is a philosophical question. It's a question of epistemology, the epistemology of economics. And so I realized that was the case with economics, that I had to answer philosophical questions. And then I realized generally, if I want to understand anything about anything deeply, I have to dive into capital P philosophy. I have to figure out metaphysics. I got to figure out epistemology. It's valuable to at least research ethics, though I find ethics very complex and confusing. And so the spirit of what I've been trying to do is just trying to come up with the most accurate worldview as I can, and that has put me squarely in the domain of philosophy. And then in terms of professionally what I do, I mean, I started doing, I graduated college. I had a very bad experience in college. I was very underwhelmed. And then I went into the nonprofit world. And I thought that, okay, maybe nonprofits are going to be a better place for somebody that's interested in ideas, because while I was in college, I was consuming a lot of literature that was produced by nonprofits like the Foundation for Economic Education and the Mises Institute. I thought, okay, well, maybe nonprofits is the way to go. And then I got fired from nonprofits twice on 2 occasions. It didn't work out. I thought, okay, maybe it is academia. I don't know. Maybe there is no spot for me. Fortunately, I have a wife who was paying the bills at the time. And I was like, okay, I think I'm actually going to just do my own independent career path. I think I'm going to try to be a freelance philosopher, if that's a thing, which it wasn't a thing. And so that was in 2014, I think. And I just started writing things that I was interested in. And then I started a podcast shortly after that called Patterson in Pursuit. And that did pretty well. I still do it. I still produce episodes fairly irregularly because we ran into some health issues, unfortunately, but we're getting back into the swing of things. And I was able to travel around the world for a couple of years, interviewing different people about a huge range of different topics. So I spoke with people, professors at Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge in person. And then I spoke with a couple of Buddhist monks, one in Japan, one in Thailand. And so I traveled around and got these interviews that were, I think, well, for me, it was like my own personal Socratic pursuit of truth that I was just recording, and people really liked it. So from there, then I got a little bit of an audience. I've written a couple of books under my own name. I wrote a book about Bitcoin. I wrote a book about philosophy. And just recently, I co-wrote a book called Hijacking Bitcoin with Roger Ver, who's a old cryptocurrency guy. And so that's something that took a few years of my time. I've been doing on the side. And so, yeah, that sort of brings you up to the present. I'm also, maybe we can talk about this later so I can finish this monologue. I'm working on releasing a research institute. So it's called the Natural Philosophy Institute. And that's sort of the culmination of many years of independent research that I'm really excited about. That probably won't happen for another few months yet.
We'll definitely come back to the Institute because I'm very curious to hear more about what you're doing there. But I'm also very curious to hear more about this path that you've been on, because in many ways it's a great deviation from what people think you have to do if you want to go into the world of ideas. Most people, if they're interested in ideas, the obvious career path is to be an academic.
Yeah.
And maybe it's to be a commentator of some sort, but generally speaking, you go into academia if you want to spend the bulk of your time wrestling with ideas and understanding how the world works, because that's how you get funded. You have your salary and you are spending part of your time teaching students and grading papers and giving lectures. And, ideally, eventually having teachers' aides working under you so that you have more space and time to do your research. And then you're getting funding to do research projects. Yeah. And what you're doing is very different from that. And I think that's so cool. First of all, how did you come to the decision that philosophy outside of academia was a path that was possible? Because you kind of laid out the step-by-steps of sort of, you decided you were going to try it and then you started traveling and doing interviews. But I imagine there was quite a bit of grappling through that process that led you to the conclusion that this was a viable path. Yeah. And then how do you sustain it? Like how does one think about building something off the traditional path in a way that's in a field that's not necessarily obvious that it can be lucrative or sustainable?
Yeah. So, I mean, the honest answer is that I sort of didn't have an option it was not like I chose philosophy off the shelf as something to do professionally. It was more like a pathology, like a pathological obsession with a particular set of abstract ideas. And I happened to be paired up with a wonderful woman who could support me as I indulged in my research. I actually had no idea if this was going to be something that would gain an audience at all, because I don't just talk about like normal, boring philosophical, issues. I'm talking about really esoteric stuff like the philosophy of mathematics is something I spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about and writing about and generating controversy about. And it never occurred to me that there would be, an audience of people who are interested in like really, stuff that's really deep in the weeds. But what I found out, and I've also seen in hindsight, is that if somebody is genuinely interested in an idea and genuinely interested in pursuing ideas for themselves, selfishly, they're in a rabbit hole that they're excited about, and if they have a way of communicating in an engaging way, then people will listen. It doesn't even matter what the topic is. If it's genuine, if you have actual curiosity and you're not faking it, and you don't think, you're not pursuing something because it sounds intelligent or because other people have pursued it, or it's just you are down a rabbit hole that you think is passionate, if you can communicate clearly, people will listen. And I didn't really know that going into it, but that has only been confirmed in hindsight. In terms of money, I mean, it was never something that was particularly lucrative for the way that I was doing it. I had a Patreon that was set up. I had made connections with people who were very generous in supporting and interested in what I was doing and supporting it. Like I've had to, when I was doing the Bitcoin stuff, I was fortunate to get involved in Bitcoin fairly early, so I didn't really need to immediately convert what I was doing into a super profitable business. I do think going forward now, because I've been so independent for so long and have had some professional success and so I've built some credibility for myself. I think what I'm doing with the Natural Philosophy Institute is going to end up being something that's probably going to be lucrative because there's an enormous demand for real independent researchers out there that aren't beholden to existing institutions, whether governmental or scientific. And a lot of times the scientific institutions are still beholden to government because they get a lot of grant money from the government. So I think I'm going to be kind of early on the alternative science and alternative academic independent career paths that I do think, and in having the conversations I've had over the years, most of them off air with different people, I don't actually think money is nearly as big a problem as somebody growing up in the middle class might think it is. So if you were to talk to, if I were to talk to the average person I grew up around with, or the average parent I grew up around with when I was young, they would have thought what I'm doing is crazy and impossible. You can't be some independent philosopher talking about what numbers are and make money. That just sounds preposterous. It is kind of preposterous, I suppose. But
when you say it like that.
I know. I've talked about more topics, but that is one of the topics I've talked about because it's interesting. I think there just is a gap where between people who have money and are looking to spend it on things that are promising even, and people that are creative, independent intellectuals that don't have those connections to wealthier people. Because when that gap is bridged, it becomes clear that money isn't the problem. People are throwing money at utterly absurd and preposterous projects at the hope that maybe we'll get something, a little granular value out of these projects. So I think going forward, it'll be clearer and clearer that there's going to be a lot more space for other independent minds to have successful careers going totally outside of academia.
I think there's a lot in what you just said to break down, because this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about too early in my career, which has been a bit more traditional than yours. I don't say that very often to people, but in the case of you, perhaps this applies. I worked a normal startup job with Praxis for a few years before striking off as a freelancer. And then I was sort of chasing much more normal sorts of freelance contracts, but it still was something that had a lot of ebb and flow to it. And I wanted to free myself from having to make decisions solely based on what the highest paying job would be. Mm-hmm. So that I could focus on the ideas and the projects that felt most exciting and most valuable to me. And I started to realize that you really can separate out the way that you think about your work and your money a little bit more than people maybe would tell you that you could. For a while, I was nomading and bouncing around, and I didn't have a lot of fixed monthly expenses. So I had the freedom to say yes and no to things because I knew that I wasn't locked into this very expensive monthly burn rate on my personal finances. I could adjust things if I needed to. It ended up working out, but knowing that you can do that is very freeing in your ability to make choices around the work that you're doing for purer reasons than just this is going to impress somebody, or I'm going to be able to afford the expensive apartment if I do this, so I probably should. Right.
And when I started doing podcasting, I think it was around 2015 or 2016, which objectively speaking is not that long ago, but the podcast world was still not what it is today. I mean, it's just self-evident that if you want to have a successful podcast and monetize it to pay the bills, you can. It's not even nobody would dare say that you can't monetize a podcast anymore, or be a YouTuber or whatever. I think these things are now in 2024 established, if that's the route that you want to take, which is really awesome. I mean, it's amazing to see. I think it's only going to grow in terms of popularity. How many people, myself included, do a huge amount of heavy lifting research on YouTube? It used to be back in the day, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, when you'd say you're doing research on YouTube, people would go, "Oh no, YouTube is not a book. You can't learn real things on YouTube." And it's listen, YouTube is a platform. I can go listen to Richard Feynman lectures on physics on YouTube right now. Like there's higher quality content on YouTube than you can get in easily by going into a library and like spending time trying to find just the right book if you know how to find it. So I do think the information landscape is completely changed with the internet, and the research landscape has changed, the career landscape has changed, and I think the world of ideas, ironically enough, is sort of one of the slower industries to sort of get caught up to just how different this landscape is now than it was 20 years ago.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. It's a great question. I think if I had to just spitball it, I think it's something to do with prestige and how prestige seems to build over a long period of time and takes a long time for the prestige numbers to change. So, for example, if you've got an academic system that over a century or two has produced luminaries, and you don't get many, like, there aren't many self-educated people outside of academia prior to 1998. There are some for sure, but academia sort of had a monopoly on libraries, not totally, but they got a lot of credibility and prestige for good reason over a long period of time compared to the alternatives. And so it makes sense to me that it would take some decades to realize that this system is over. The universities don't have a monopoly on almost anything. Maybe on some laboratory equipment, they can do some interesting work that your average person can't do in their basement. But in terms of a ton of research, since we can do most of it online, I think it's going to take some time before the prestige game is done shifting. It's already shifted massively. The old legacy institutions have lost an enormous amount of credibility over the past 5 years. But I just still don't. Obviously, we're not in totally in the new system yet. Like, people still are a little bit hesitant when you say I did a bunch of research on the line. They're like, oh, well, I don't know what that means. And eventually 10 years from now, 20 years from now, generations will have grown up, and that's the only way that you do real research, or mostly.
How do you think about the prestige game and how it affects or does not affect the work that you do? Because a lot of people rely on it very heavily to get their foot in the door, to have a conversation in the first place, or to get someone to listen to their ideas. You can say, well, I was educated at Harvard, and people say, well, you must have good ideas. I guess I'll buy your book.
Yeah, right.
How does that affect you, or what do you think your counterpart is? If you don't have the prestige thing and most of the world is making decisions based off of it, how do you think about competing?
Well, I'm definitely the wrong person to ask, because in my own research, I have discovered that I think the ideas coming out of academia and the orthodoxies are absolutely terrible in almost every domain. And so I don't buy their prestige. So it's very easy for me to not have to worry about the prestige game, because I think the competition has failed massively, and a lot of people just don't realize it yet. And I'm very comfortable with being in this position. However, I do think there's one way or another, there's a long run prestige game being played. And if I happen to be right about my intuitions, and other people are right about their intuitions about the failures of academia, that in fact, at some point, we'll have more prestige chips on the table than they do, right? To be early to a shifting of the information landscape, to say, look, these people who are held up as highly intelligent, highly prestigious intellectuals are actually fraudulent. Many of them are fraudulent, and the world is shifting to where the next generation intellectuals are not going to be coming from academia, or many of them are not going to be coming from academia. If you're early to that, you gain prestige points. It's like, if you're early to the 2008 financial crisis and you're calling it before anybody else is calling it, you actually gain credibility and prestige points. So I do think there is a long-term game being played now that I suppose I'm in the middle of. But even if it doesn't pan out, and even if it takes multiple decades, I'm still okay with that, just because I don't think this prestige at present is warranted. And so if I'm going to be considered, a crackpot for a long time, it doesn't bother me that much.
You said a lot of the prestige is fraudulent.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? Because that's a very big statement.
Sure. So for example, I have 100 examples I can give you here, but are you aware that the food pyramid turns out to be bunk? The food
Yeah,
pyramid,
it's
the
upside down, basically.
upside down, yeah, more or less, closer to being exactly false than being true. Okay, how does that happen? Interesting question, right? A question of social epistemology, a question of institutional failure. Amazing. I will just note that given the fact that a lot of people know that the food pyramid is upside down and could almost not be more wrong than it is, this has credibility and prestige implications. So when I say that whatever institution that produced the food pyramid demonstrates that they do not deserve their credibility or their prestige. And I can go through a very long list of examples like that. Ideas that are held up as being true that are closer to being the exact inversion of the truth. And so when you see this pattern over and over and over, you say, okay, well, clearly the prestige is unearned because this system keeps producing absolutely garbage ideas all the time that have real world implications, that harm people's health, that harm their social relations, and so on. So,
Can we go through a couple more? The real examples are very helpful illustrations.
Sure. Okay, so there's a recent one would be controversial with COVID lockdowns. I would say that there's overwhelming evidence that COVID lockdowns were a bad idea. Didn't make economic sense, didn't make medical sense, had enormous damage on the entire world. And that came directly from academia. There was a bunch of snooty academics proposing this. And then that ended up damaging the world in profound ways that we'll never really understand the full implications of. So that would be an example where whatever system produced the idea that, oh, you know what we should do to combat this virus is lock everything down and mandatory masks. And then you can get into the issue of mandatory vaccinations with new vaccines, that look like they are more dangerous than any other vaccines that have been rolled out in centuries. So there would be a bunch of examples. There's a funny example I've given on a couple of shows, which is the hot hand fallacy. Have you heard about this?
No.
Okay. I have to try to summarize it because this is a fun and funny one that we could talk about for a long time. Okay, so the summarized version of the hot hand fallacy is: do you do any sports?
I play, not really.
Not really.
I was gonna claim some, but I don't think I play it enough for it to count.
Okay. So
we'll go with no.
Okay. So in sports, there is a phenomenon which everybody will report, which is colloquially called the hot hand. Like if you're playing in basketball, you get in the zone. There's this concept of getting in the zone where you make a few baskets and then you're in the zone and you can make a bit more. You're more of an accurate shot, or you're playing golf and the swing is just right today, and so you get on a hot streak. Okay, this is effectively a universal experience that people have when they're trying to do sports or anything, is getting in the zone. Okay, well, big-brained academics a few decades ago tried to do statistical analyses of people reporting the hot hand. And they said for multiple decades, the consensus was that the reported experience of the hot hand is a fallacy. It's in fact a cognitive illusion. There is no such thing as the hot hand, despite when they would these academics would poll professional sports players or coaches. It was like 98% of them reported believing in that was a hot hand. But these brilliant academics said, no, hot hand doesn't exist. It's a statistical illusion. And they did this by looking, I think the original paper was, they were looking at the success, I think it was these Philadelphia 76ers in like the 1980s or something. They were looking at the patterns of successful baskets from individual players and trying to do statistical analysis. Anyway, it was this big controversy. And so literally, I'm not exaggerating, for multiple decades, academics were saying, they were so confident that the math has spoken, that the hot hand is an illusion, that there was academic literature written about this amazing phenomenon of lay people doubting that the hot hand was a fallacy. In other words, they were trying to answer the question, how could regular people be so dumb that they still believe that the hot hand still exists when we have mathematically shown it's an illusion? Okay, this was multiple decades that this academia had concluded something was false that everybody else said is definitely true. Well, it turns out that the hot hand fallacy was itself a fallacy, that they, for a bunch of reasons, they were confused in their statistical analyses, and those, block-headed lay people were actually onto something when they said, I don't care about your statistical analysis. The hot hand is a real phenomenon that you can experience after 2 weeks of trying to take up a sport. You will also discover the hot hand. So anyway, this is a very large scandal, and it should be a complete embarrassment that it would take multiple decades of painful work to figure out why these dumb academics were so confused that they made these, intellectual blunders. And you have to kind of like a farmer going behind a cow and picking up its manure. You got to figure out, somebody has to figure out, where did these people go wrong? Anyway, they went wrong in many places, and it's a scandal and an embarrassment. And yet another demonstration that whatever system produced multiple decades of snooty academics telling you that their statistical analyses have demonstrated that something self-evidently true to you is false. Whatever system produces that and takes multiple decades to correct does not deserve prestige. It does not deserve credibility. It annihilates its own credibility. And so I could go through and give you many more examples, but they have piled up. And so this is this is very related to what I'm doing with the Natural Philosophy Institute, because what I found over a period of many years of research on many, many different domains is that this type of error, this level of error, is actually the norm in essentially every discipline. There are foundational, elementary blunders in every area of thought. And believe it or not, math and physics included. I wouldn't have believed that myself 10 years ago prior to researching it, but even in the domains of math and physics, especially when you're examining the fundamentals, there are really, really, really bad fuzzy concepts in play here. So I've come to the conclusion, in the past few years, that we're effectively living in a dark age. And I think this dark age stretches back a little bit more than a century. Maybe we can get into that if you're interested. But what I want to be doing at the Natural Philosophy Institute is actually cataloging, so we don't forget, in domain after domain after domain after domain, that here is a bunch of really bad ideas. It took 30 years to recognize that these were bad ideas, or sometimes we're still in that 30-year zone, and people will eventually realize that these are bad ideas. And so what I want to have is like a heterodox Wikipedia. You essentially go to it and you have the list of, right now I'm over like 100 different topics where you can say, okay, here's the orthodoxy, and here's really good arguments why it's bad, why the orthodoxy is wrong. And this isn't just like some hand-wavy thing, oh yeah, the orthodoxy is wrong. It's like, no, we're actually going to go in painstaking detail and historical detail to give high-quality explanations for why the paradigms that we're in are so crummy. And intellectual analysis and both historical analysis for that. So that's a long way of answering your question, that the academy does not deserve a great amount of the prestige that it has at present, because they have failed in virtually every single domain if you examine deeply enough.
Do you have the insistence on teaching reading via the whole word method instead of phonics in your heterodox Wikipedia?
I have never examined it. Please tell me more, though.
Okay, so this is one of the big scandals in the education world. It's finally become a fairly mainstream idea, or mainstream knowledge, that we've been teaching our children how to read incorrectly for decades.
Sounds right.
Phonics is the art of teaching children how to decode our language and other languages that use the same alphabet that we do.
Okay.
If you teach kids the sounds of the letters, they can look at a word they've never seen before and they can sound it out. It's very basic knowledge. This is how you probably learned how to read.
I didn't realize there was an
homeschooled. So this is how I learned how to read too. I was shocked when I realized there was a different way of doing this. But in schools for decades, children were taught to read using the whole word method, which had been basically, it was determined that this was actually the correct and superior way to teach kids how to read. So in the whole word method, it's basically word recognition. So you memorize what a word looks like, and then you see it and you recall it.
Sounds like a terrible idea.
Basically, you're throwing away the entire coding magic of understanding the sounds of the alphabet.
Yeah. And this took off. This became the required recommended.
This was standard practice for decades.
Naturally.
Generations of children learned how to read using the whole word method. And part of the whole word method is the idea that if you don't recognize a word, you're supposed to use context clues to guess. So instead of sounding it out, you look at the other words in the sentence and you try to guess what it means, which can lead you to very grave errors in understanding the context of a sentence or a paragraph. And this was standard practice.
Yeah.
And there have been many books written about why can't our children read? Why are their reading scores so low? And it might be because we're making it unnecessarily hard for them by teaching them the whole word method. This feels to me like perhaps it is a contender for being in your heterodox.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'm definitely going to add that to the list of things to research. Let me, a couple of things on this. So I wonder, so I'm just thinking aloud here. I wonder if this idea was put forward by education specialists, like specific, like who are the academics that decided this was going to be the new protocol? I would imagine it's education PhDs or something. So just one aside, people might be familiar with this term called the replication crisis that happened in psychology.
I was going to bring this up too.
Yeah. So in the domain of psychology, I don't know, maybe a little bit, I think it was more than a decade now ago, it became well known that there is a replication crisis going on, which means that the scientific papers that were written, a huge percentage of them, I want to say it was like 60%. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember the exact number in psychology, at least, couldn't replicate, which means that their value is approximately zero with how the scientific method is currently practiced. So this would be the entire field of psychology was thrown into crisis with the replication crisis. Well, since then, since this was made, international news in the field of psychology, it's now been shown that the same thing is happening in virtually every other domain. It's not as severe it doesn't seem to be as severe as in psychology, but you have the replication crisis in biology. You have the replication crisis in physics, although for a different set of reasons. You have the replication crisis everywhere, which is enormous. It's a methodological problem, demonstration that the methodology of science is broken. Okay. Let me give you another funny example that this just happened. I took a trip to New York like a month ago. And I was talking to one of my old friends who I hadn't spoken with in a long time. And she was interested in archaeology. And I was telling her a similar story that I've told you, that in every domain, I just keep finding there are these orthodox ideas that are garbage. And then you learn about the history, and they're scandalous too. There's a bunch of like scientific scandals, political scandals in different domains that you wouldn't expect them, again, even in physics. And she was saying, oh, let me tell you. She goes, in archaeology, I was like, tell me about archaeology. She goes, oh yeah, everybody knows that Egyptian archaeology is super corrupt. And then she was telling me about, they'll destroy objects. The Egyptian government is involved because they have a certain historical narrative that they're trying to craft. And so like the domain of Egyptian archaeology is so much, it's foundational work in archaeology, but so much of it is bunk and scandalous bunk because of this type of corruption. And I just laughed because so when I go around and talk to people about this, if they have research in a particular domain, they're ready to tell me, well, let me tell you about what's happening in Egyptian archaeology. It's so corrupt there too. So I've just heard the story over and over and over and over. And this is another reason why I think, okay, maybe we're just in a dark age. Our intellectual institutions have catastrophically failed in a way that we don't fully understand right now, but somebody's got to try to get to the bottom of it.
I went down the rabbit hole recently. I had a very long road trip, and on this very long road trip, I was binge listening to interviews with Graham Hancock.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. Okay, the guy who did the Ancient Apocalypse Netflix series,
yeah.
Fingerprints of the Gods book. Basically, his ideas, for those who are not familiar, is he hypothesizes that human civilization is much older than we think it is. And that there is archaeological evidence that suggests that we were an advanced civilization long before conventional archaeology and conventional history accept that we are. And we keep finding things that are older and older. Yeah. And his hypothesis is that there was a cosmic event, like an asteroid belt that we passed through that caused a mass extinction of
Oh,
our
interesting.
civilization. There were sea level rises, very dramatic sea level rises at the end of the Ice Age. And his hypothesis is that civilization is often largely coastal and that a lot of our civilization got wiped out and had to kind of restart. Really interesting stuff and very counter to the conventional hypotheses. And the reason I'm thinking about this now is you mentioned Egypt, and he mentioned in one of the interviews that he wanted to go to Egypt as part of filming his documentary series because the pyramids are such a controversial part of history, and the country of Egypt would not let him into the country to film. They didn't want to be part of his documentary.
Yeah, that's funny.
Which is very interesting. But you see this again and again where there are people who, in different fields, like you said, who will question the narrative, and they get very unilaterally scorned by the rest of their field.
Yeah.
And it always, there's the appeal to prestige. Well, all of the people from these prestigious institutions think this person is wrong. Right. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe we better steer clear. Maybe they're contagious. I don't want to be touched by that. But at the same time, there's such a culture of that, of leaning on prestige and not being open to people questioning a field where people's reputations and careers are at stake. When you get into the politics of it, it's very, very interesting to see how common this is, like you said, across different fields of study.
Yeah, there is an intuitive idea that I used to hold, which is that intellectual paradigms are established based on their quality. That seems like it's kind of obvious that the ideas that are held up as orthodoxy are really good ideas, and that's just not the case. That just historically, I don't even know any domain which I would say definitely the best ideas won out here. What happens is because the world of ideas is filled with humans, it becomes political. Sometimes it becomes political in a governmental sense, that the state gets involved and says, "This, we're going to act as if this is truth or this is not truth." There are many examples of that, but also just normal human politics of people fighting one another for prestige, for money, for credibility. And there's a dynamic in the world of ideas which also makes it difficult, which is if you can really be invalidated at a very deep level. Like if you're a researcher who's working with some particular hypothesis and it turns out that you're completely wrong, that's devastating. It's devastating to your credibility. So there are vicious fights among academics and intellectuals for control of the narrative so that they don't get embarrassed and so they can also keep money flowing. And that, unfortunately, I literally cannot think of a single exception off the top of my head where I would say there's some domain which this doesn't apply. I would say of all the areas that I've researched, chemistry seems to me there seems to be the most impressive structures of knowledge in chemistry. And I think this is because it's sort of in a sweet spot where in chemistry you can do cheap experiments to see whether or not the claims of academics are true or not. And in fact, in many cases, you can literally do them in your basement. You can get a lot of chemicals online. For whatever reason, state regulation of chemicals seems to be very slow. So you get some pretty wild chemicals online of something that you want to do. I don't really understand why that's the case, but I'm happy it's the case. So chemistry seems pretty rigorous until you get down to the fundamentals of chemistry, because then it blends into physics, and physics is kind of a mess and has been for a little while. So yeah, so I do want to make one big caveat though. When I say these things, I am making a big exception for engineers and engineering. I think scientific, academic, intellectual pursuits come in different categories, and what scientists and theoreticians are trying to do is very different than what engineers are trying to do. That there has been undeniable, wonderful progress of engineers, almost nonstop progress over the 20th century. Though I'm like super critical of the theoretical ideas of the 20th century, engineers have made a bunch of progress. And again, I think this is because they're just immediately connected to reality. The thing they're trying to build either works or it doesn't work. They get immediate feedback in a way that people who are doing more of the philosophizing or the theorizing, they don't get that feedback. And so it might take 30 years or 40 years before you realize the food pyramid is nonsense. Or it might take, another recent scandal was the paper that was that turned the what is it called? In Alzheimer's, there's a the connection between brain plaque and Alzheimer's disease. This was an idea that goes back some decades, but I think it was in like 2004 or so. There was a big paper that made this connection stronger, and we said, okay, now we really think Alzheimer's is caused by these amyloid beta plaques in the brain. Well, it took 20 years. This just recently came out that, oopsie, turns out that paper was fraudulent, not just wrong, but that the lady who created that paper fabricated images. And there was a bunch of evidence that had been accumulating over the past 20 years saying that the medications that we were taking to reduce the brain plaque didn't actually improve outcomes of Alzheimer's. There was already evidence that that theory was wrong anyway, but it turns out the fundamentals of it were established based on fraud. So anyway, that takes multiple decades. That's not an immediate process that we figure this out right away. It's a process that takes, unfortunately, 20 years is a pretty short cycle. From my research, it takes at least 30 years or more to figure out that there has been things as obvious as fraud at play that have established these narratives that are still harming people. And again, like I know I don't want to make this just a list of scandals in different domains of thought, but what I'm trying to do with the Dark Age, I'm calling it the Dark Age Research Project. I'm just categorizing these different domains of thought and the different scandals that have taken place in them. The one that takes up the most space on that list is in the domain of medicine. Medicine over the past 100 years, you wouldn't think this, I certainly wouldn't have thought it 10 years ago, but it is absolutely disturbing to realize that it's not just the food pyramid, and it's not just, Alzheimer's medication or statins, or the stories about vaccines, or the way that the modern birthing practices and the frequency of C-sections and Patterson. And the list is absolutely disturbing when you go through and you start to take seriously the notion that maybe it's all bunk, maybe it's all wrong, maybe whatever process is establishing these ideas is fundamentally flawed, and maybe we can't take anything they say at face value. Yeah, the one unexpectedly, literally at the top of the list is medicine, which affects everybody.
I wanted to ask you, when you started talking about engineering, if there was a free market component to there being fewer scandals or fewer incorrect assumptions being acted upon, that engineering is a little more intersected with the free market of real estate and building project development. And so there's a different set of incentives. But then you would think medicine would also be subjected to some of the same. I know there's a lot of asterisks along with that, but you would think that there would be some of the same incentive pulls within medicine. Is there a component of that going on?
It's an interesting thought. I would say in medicine, medicine and finance are the two domains at least in the U.S., which are competing for being the most heavily regulated. So we don't have anything resembling a free market in finance or in medicine. So in that case, I think
anyone who's interacted with the healthcare system knows that this is true.
It's atrocious. I think it actually is. Medicine is now, I think it has been for a few years, the most heavily regulated of all the domains. So that's not a free market there. But I do think it is an additional dynamic which is going to keep engineers closer to truth and reality. So you have the immediate feedback of did the thing work or not that you're trying to build, and then on top of that, you have the profit incentive. Not only did the thing work, but was it useful? Did people find it useful, and is it able to be built profitably? That's another feedback mechanism that forces let's say, selects for competence much more strongly than in more theoretical academic disciplines.
You've brought up the idea of the Dark Ages that we're currently in multiple times. Can we define this really tightly for a second? Where did it begin? Why are you calling it the Dark Ages? We've sort of described it, but I want to define it too, because this is a really interesting idea and very counter to what most people would assume about the era we live in.
Right. So when I say that I think we're living in a dark age, I mean to say that all of our structures of knowledge are plagued by errors at every level. So it doesn't mean that all our beliefs are false. So I'm not a flat earther. I think, when I try to sound reasonable to people, I only have a very limited set of things I can say because I believe most people are wrong about everything. But I get to say like, no, the earth is round, okay? I'm not a crazy person. The earth is round. What I mean, though, is that there are small errors that are throughout our scientific knowledge. It can be errors like a paper that is written gets some of the numbers wrong. They get a sign that was inverted. It can be very, they can have effects on the world, but they're very small and trivial, like typos, effectively that level of error. But also all the way up to the deep and the profound ones, like if we're talking about physics, whether or not there is a measurement independent world is a very fundamental concept that was in question around the turn of the 20th century with the foundations of quantum mechanics. And we might be wrong about that one as well. It could actually be, turns out there is, in fact, a measurement independent world out there. So at all levels, you can't just believe anything that the system has produced, which is actually like the worst conclusion, because that doesn't mean you can. It would be nice if you could say, let's throw it all out. We'll just start from scratch. But that doesn't work either, because there's a whole bunch of really good stuff in there as well. It's like it's the diamonds in the rough. There's a whole lot of rough, but there really are diamonds there. And it's probably not a good idea just to clean break, start literally from scratch and rethink everything in all domains up from nothing. That's very hard. So that's what I mean. Now, in terms of its history, this is something I'm still researching, but for my estimation, I say that I think this dark age started sometime around 1880, and it was a formative period from 1880 to the end of World War II, 1945, let's say. That was the foundation. That was the formation of the Dark Age. And let's say that is where we had essentially in every single domain, you had some revolution that took place. And there was a new paradigm that was established within that time frame. So in mathematics, you had, for example, the realization that Euclidean geometry was not a priori true. You had the development of non-Euclidean geometries, which Euclidean geometry was considered for 2 millennium to be the foundations of mathematics. That turned out to be wrong. And so the domain was put in crisis and never really resolved that crisis. But we had a foundational crisis in mathematics. In physics, it was the development of relativity. This was a new foundation for physics as well. You had the development of critical concepts in biology. And it's called the modern synthesis in biology was created that blended genetics and evolutionary thinking together. You had, the Freudian revolution. To the extent there is still, psychoanalysis is not as big a deal as it used to be, but that was also established then. It was a fundamental idea. You had the establishment of what we would say is like computer science during this time as well. So domain after domain, you had huge revolutions that were taking place during this time period. And so those are virtually all the paradigms that we live under right now intellectually, from what I can tell, were established, or almost all of them were established during this time period. And it just so happens you also had massive economic revolutions and political revolutions around the world during this time. You had electrification, for goodness sake, that happened during this. You had different public health measures that became popular during this time. You had the communist revolutions. You had 2 world wars. You had the worst, World War II was the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. Most people died. You had the establishment at the end of World War II of the Bretton Woods system, which is the sort of the international financial system that we live under right now, where the dollar has been considered the world's reserve currency. That happened at the end of World War II. So that's sort of where I think these ideas were. They came up and then they solidified within that like 70-year time period. The origins of some of the ideas I think do stretch back farther, maybe to the Enlightenment or before. I'm not 100% sure, but there was a whole lot happening in that 70-year time period. That I think in order to get ourselves out of the state that we're in right now, we really have to examine those critical paradigmatic ideas. Even though there's a lot of sacred cows there, a lot of things that are going to be very unsettling to people to rethink. That I think is what has to be done to get us out of our current situation.
It feels like there's a paradox here,
Yeah.
because simultaneously we had some of the biggest scientific revolutions in history. In this period, we split the atom, and we discovered or learned how to fly, and the seeds of space travel were sown, and we had enormous medical advancements that have measurably and definitively prolonged and improved the duration of a human life on average. There has been a lot that has actually happened that is measurable and that was revolutionary.
Mm.
And it feels counterintuitive that that would go hand in hand with the sort of breakdown of knowledge that happens simultaneously. Why do those two things happen at the same time? Does one beget the other? And by one begetting the other, I would assume that would mean the advances then beget the sort of breakdown of knowledge. What happened?
Well, so I'm gonna push back on the premise here. So
Please.
some of what I think you've said is true. Some of it I'm not quite so sure. So there were definitely advances in physics, the splitting of the atom and the development of the atom bomb. This is probably, I would say, the biggest exception that I can think of in the story that I've just laid out specifically was atomic physics, though it should be noted, it's an interesting story because the people that were most involved with the Manhattan Project tended to be more experimentalists and more empirically minded than doing high theory. So I'm actually not sure that it's an open question in my mind whether or not the development of the atom bomb and atomic physics was something that was a scientific breakthrough or technological breakthrough. Does credit go to the engineers or does it go to the theoreticians? Or in reality, there's some mixture of the two. And this is open in my mind. From what I've seen, I do think that would be the strongest case for saying the theoreticians did a lot of good. The other examples I'm less confident of. So when you're talking about the undeniable progress in terms of extension of human life, could you explain a little bit more what the observation is that you're describing? Is it just life extension?
There is a life extension component. There have been great advances in modern medicine, along with all the things that you've mentioned that are...
So, like, could you give me an example? I know it's a weird question, but can you just give me an example?
No, absolutely. You're going to have to forgive me for errors in dates because this is not my wheelhouse. But if I recall correctly, didn't sterilization become, like sterilization of instruments, didn't that become common practice in this era that you're referencing?
Yeah, this is an interesting... Okay, a few points on this.
I could be
this is
mistaken
good.
about the dates here.
Yeah. I also could... It's been a little while, but you're talking about
We can Google
Yeah,
this.
we could.
I'm gonna Google this right now while you're talking. When did it become common practice to sterilize the instruments that you were using in an operation?
Here's the fun part, though. So I'm gonna... so please do that, because it would be great to put... I would love to know the dates. It was sometime in the 1800s. Little story about that, though. So the story that comes to mind that I do have a little bit of knowledge to share is there was I want to say he was an Austrian, some European gentleman by the name of Semmelweis. And he was the guy who thought that there were infectious diseases being passed from birthing mothers to other birthing mothers, that when mothers would go in, they'd give birth in the hospital, they might end up with a fever that he was trying to find the origins of. And he had his own theory of what we would essentially say it was like a proto-bacterial theory, saying that there's something being transferred from mother to mother. And so he came up with, it wasn't sterilization, I think it was just basic hand washing procedures. I think this was in the 1800s. Now, but the story there is get this is particularly depressing. The medical establishment called him a crackpot, said this is crazy. You're talking about there are little invisible things we can't see that are being passed from mother to mother. Get this. There were actually hospitals who took Semmelweis seriously that went along with his regimen for hand washing. They empirically saw and recorded a increase in the health of mothers. They had less infant mortality. They had less, I think it was called some kind of fever that was being passed from birthing mothers. It's in their records that they recorded a drop in the frequency of these bad outcomes. And yet, despite that, because of the academic pressure that was put on Semmelweis, they eventually demonized him. They rescinded their policies. They said, we're not going to go along with your crazy kooky theory about there being little microscopic things we can't see. And they reverted to their old procedures, which actually resulted in an increase again in mortality, of infant mortality and a reduction of the health of the mother. So this would be an example of the academic system getting it wrong, getting their theory wrong, and getting their empirical despite them having empirical observations that their theory was wrong, they still didn't adjust. So I don't exactly know when hand washing became a thing after that, but this would be an example. This is more, I think, of the triumph of people who are trying to point at empirical experimentation rather than sitting and theorizing and saying, okay, no, we know for some scientific abstract reason why hand washing is a good idea or a bad idea. They just actually look at the evidence, which is more in the spirit of engineering. Okay, I can see that you have some information to share.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of Googling, and it's more of a continuum than I realized, which makes sense. There were two major contributions to the art of sterilization in the 1860s. The first was French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who wrote extensively on germs causing disease.
Yeah.
And the English physician Joseph Lister, who was developing a technique to spray disinfectant on instruments. Both of those were in the 1860s. The late 1800s, steam sterilization became much more widespread. And in the early 1900s, various methodologies of sterilization became more common, and it became more commonplace and standard practice.
Okay, very cool.
So a little bit before the window you're referencing.
So let me riff on this just a little bit. By the way, I would guess this is where Listerine comes from. I don't know.
That was my guess too.
Okay, so I know Pasteur is with pasteurization.
Yeah.
Let me talk a little bit about this because it is very relevant, actually, to answering your question. So this Pasteur is an interesting character, and this is a great example of where good ideas can be mixed with really, really, really bad ideas. So the discovery of microbes happened around this time, and unfortunately, it came with bad consequences. So I don't know if I've spoken about this story in public. That you'll have to forgive me. I'm trying to assimilate all of my knowledge and then tell a coherent story here. When at this time, because they were just developing like microscopes, and they were just developing the ability to look at these tiny little microscopic organisms, there were a bunch of wonky ideas that came out from Pasteur himself. One of which is that the assumption is that the body was in a state of sterility, and that if there were organisms in body tissue, this was an aberration. Sterility, say in the lungs or in the brain, was assumed to be the default state because we didn't really have the tools to tell us whether or not that wasn't the case. And the existence of these microorganisms was the aberration. And so this is where you get the ideas of this is where a lot of our fundamental ideas about infectious disease come from. Oh, you have a disease, it's because there's some particular pathogen that caused it. The trouble is, it's a whole lot more complex than that. We know now, like it took us like a century to figure this out. Nothing in the body is sterile. Lungs aren't sterile, brain's not sterile. There's nothing in your body that is sterile. There are organisms living everywhere. There's a microbiome, not just of your gut, but of your organs as well. This would have been very surprising to Pasteur. Part of the problem, one of the problems here, is that infectious disease turns out to be a lot more complex than the mere existence of a particular pathogen. It's the existence of a pathogen in particular relation to the rest of your microbiome, and also in relation to the health of the host. So, for example, it can be that a whole lot of people are carrying the tuberculosis bacteria, but they don't have the signs of tuberculosis, nor will they. It's only a subset of some crazy huge percentage of people have tuberculosis in terms of they actually have the bacteria, but only a small subset of those have the symptoms. Why is that the case? It's clearly not the mere presence of the organism. So unfortunately, this sterile organ theory that we get from this general time period, though there's some truth to it, there's some power in that theory, I think that's actually contributed to really bad reasoning about infectious disease that turns out to be a lot more complex than whether or not there was one particular pathogen or another. Okay, so that's just that we're just riffing here on Pasteur. I want to just bring back to this idea that there was a lot of progress during this time period. My overall response to that is that I think when you examine closer and closer, you're going to find it was less scientific progress, less academic theoretical progress, and more the progress of engineers and those who are, you might call, experimentalist researchers. You brought up flying. Well, flying didn't happen. Flying, creating airplanes was not something that came out of a university. That came out of people who were like weren't the Wright brothers like
They were both bike mechanics.
bike mechanics,
Yeah,
right?
they were bicycle repairmen.
Right, exactly. Right. So, and that would be a straightforward example where the theory ends up getting pushed along by the engineer and the empiricist, and then the theoretician comes along later and says, "Oh, well, let me tell you about aerodynamics and blah blah blah." But really, the breakthroughs were established by, I just call them, more empirically minded people or experimentalists. So I think you'll see that pattern is actually what was going on in the early 20th century. Even with the Manhattan Project and the breakthroughs in physics, though I will grant, I think that one of all the other domains that I've looked at, all the other historical examples, I think that one you had, let's say, like the highest IQ points, the most actual real contribution from like academic minds probably was with physics, at least back then. Though I would also say that success and prestige has not carried on throughout 20th century physics. We don't have Einsteins right now. We had the great breakthroughs. We had the atom bomb that was, let's say an intellectual breakthrough, even if it was, a moral catastrophe. But where has this progress? This progress has not continued. We don't have this many wins coming from physics for the last 70 years. So I think that should also be noted.
Is it a fair summarization to say that the argument is that true hands-on experimentation and empirical research has continued to grow and expand, and over the course of the past century we have seen progress, and the line between where we've seen progress and where we're in the dark ages is between the hands-on experimentation, the building, and the more raw theory?
So yes, I think that's fair, though in practice, I think you get a lot of theorizing. The academic theorizing gets in the way quite frequently of empirical work. So I can't tell you the number of times that the story happens at the abstract, which is there's some empirically minded person who wants to do something, and then there's a long line of people who have academic training and who have a bunch of theories in their head about what's possible. Say, that's impossible. We know for such and such reason, for such and such. You could, even the Wright brothers, this was the case. And if those individuals are dissuaded, or or they don't get funding because the people that would have funded that individual were instead persuaded by the academics, I think you get a negative influence of theory on practice, which is funny. I say this as like the most theoretically minded person. Like, I'm obsessed with the theory side of things. That's the thing I love. Like, that is true, Platonic philosophy to its core. I just recognize that we don't have a great track record. And if I were to give advice to people that want to build stuff, I would say don't spend too much time worrying about what the theoreticians say, because historically speaking, they're almost wrong. They're wrong about almost every single point all the time at every point in history about every topic. So I would also say, generally speaking, the experience comes first, the theory comes second. So theoreticians, generally speaking, are going to be building off of other people's experiences, whether the experiences can be, lab tests that are done, objects that are constructed, like an engineer is constructing a plane, and now we have to say, okay, well, how is this possible? So we sit and we think, and we, run an especially hot bath, and we go, okay, I really got to figure out how this thing is possible. But that kind of theorizing comes second to the empirical practice. There are little asterisks here all over the place, where I would have to say at the end of the day, sort of theory trumps all, but for practical purposes, 99% of the case, that's not true. I think theory oftentimes gets in the way of practice.
And how do you define the difference? Because we're breaking down an entire centuries worth of paradigms about how information works and how information evolves. How would you describe the difference between the empirical evidence of having built something and the empirical evidence of conducting a study and doing a bunch of research and aggregating data, and yet running into a replication crisis later? But at the onset, you might think that's also empirical. You're using evidence. You're measuring things. What's the difference?
Yeah, well, what qualifies as evidence, right? This is actually part of the problem I think we find ourselves in the dark age, is that people are treating theory as data. They get it reversed. So, like, for example, you saw this with COVID all the time. Does ivermectin work or not for treating COVID? One type of response is people will say, well, look at the scientific papers. Look at the randomized controlled trials, assuming that the randomized controlled trials were generating evidence, that's the real experience, the real empirical inquiry is done with the RCT. That's literally backwards. That's actually not correct at all, because those RCTs were constructed based on a bunch of theory. And it turns out that theory, in many cases, was wrong or fraudulent or scandalous. So, for example, if in your RCT you're systemically underdosing people who are most likely to be affected by COVID, then it doesn't matter what your data is if you've got methodological, theoretical problems in constructing your experiment or your trial. So on the question of whether or not ivermectin works for COVID infections, where do we go to find evidence? Is it academia, or is it in the clinics of doctors who are actually prescribing the medication and can say, this is what I did and this is what I saw? That's actually, I think, as much evidence as you can get. I mean, ultimately, the evidence lies with the individual. You could say, from my experience, this is what I did and this is what happened. But in the context of you're going to a doctor, it's the clinicians that are closest to the actual real world evidence. But there's a problem here, because most clinicians are not writing academic papers. So you have there's a huge methodological gap between the clinicians and the theoreticians. You've got people I saw this pattern all the time. You have people like myself who are doing more research. They're reading scientific papers, but they're not realizing that because of methodological flaws, the quality of the papers that they're reading is very poor. And so you have to listen to the clinicians and the practitioners who are actually the experimentalists, if you will. You have to actually just listen to them and see what they're saying. And then when you read, the papers, you can go, okay, this is where I see there's a disconnect here. This is why should it be that we have a situation where the clinicians are saying one thing and academic researchers are saying another? How is that possible? Well, you understand it. If you listen to both sides, you'll understand how that's possible. And generally speaking, the problems are on the academic side, the theoretical side, and not the empirical or the clinical side. So that would be one example of answering your question, where it matters to try to disambiguate what counts as theory and what counts as data here. It's not so clear. You really got to think carefully about it to sort it out.
You mentioned earlier the implications of the prestige that's attached to having a successful career inside of academia. Once you've published something, you're incentivized to publish something that is interesting and groundbreaking and respected, which would lead one to be incentivized to make a theory that they have work so they can publish a paper on it. But then once you've published it, there's a great incentive for it to stay accepted.
Yeah.
Because your career success, your career trajectory, your intelligence is tied to it. And I think there's an interesting component here of the sort of veneration of intelligence and intelligence being measured by very specific systemic markers. You're considered to be intelligent if you are accepted into a prestigious institution, and then you are considered intelligent if you publish something groundbreaking, and then that thing becomes a part of our understanding of the field in which you work. And there's something in that warps incentives a little bit. And I'm curious to hear how you think about this as someone who's working outside of that system and has a very different set
Yeah.
of incentives pulling on you, how much you see the way we think of measuring intelligence as this ego thing or this
Uh,
mark of worthiness
yes.
as being perhaps problematic,
Yeah.
and what it would look like, because pursuit of thought and ideas and knowledge is considered to be virtuous by many people for good reason.
Yeah.
But how do you separate that out from the ego side of intelligence
Yeah.
that keeps you from just getting drawn into playing these games that you're talking about?
So that's like the best question ever. Please keep asking that to future guests. It is very important, very, very important culturally speaking, that we get a hold of intelligence. I think actually this is part of what happened with the Dark Age. And I should say, this is actually part of what happened with the Enlightenment. So it stretches back further than that. That there is a overvaluation and an overestimation of the ability of the intellect and therefore the value of the intellect. This is such a weird thing for me to say because I really have devoted my life to the world of ideas. This is my thing. I'm obsessed with it and I love it. And yet, okay, I have a good answer. I have a good answer here. All right. So why does the worship of the intellect get us into so much trouble? Culturally and intellectually. I think the answer is due to the complexity problem. The world turns out to be unbelievably complex. How complex? We don't know. That's how complex it is. It's so complex, we don't know how complex it is. When you start researching fundamental processes of nature more and more closely, at some point you go, this is way more advanced that we understand. Like your best theory about how nature operates is a tiny little tip of the iceberg. And then you look under the surface and you realize what's under the surface and you go, oh my gosh, this is all interconnected. And it turns out that the divisions we have between different domains are fake. Like you can't actually understand psychology without understanding philosophy, which implies understanding maybe a little bit of economics and some political theory, because humans are political creatures. And so it turns out all of these domains blend together and there are unfathomably unknown complex relations here. So what happens is that we get a little excited about our little theories and we're wrong all the time and always have been about virtually everything. We think, I have figured out the truth. This is, the French Revolution was like peak arrogant intellect that thinks it understands. It has broken the shackles of dogma and it now understands that we need to have 10-day work weeks, and because it's base 10 or whatever. There's a litany of crazy things that they did in the French Revolution that they thought sounded really smart and they were really impressed with themselves. The cult of reason sounds really, really smart. The reason that doesn't work is because of the complexity problem. So, and this is true in every single domain. When you keep scratching deeper and deeper, you'll find nothing is simple, at least in nature. Everything's complex, and so we need to have way more humility in thinking about the level of sophistication of our understanding of the world. So, yeah, I guess that's my take. Is culturally speaking, I think at some point one can realize that the intellect. It's not that it's inherently flawed. I don't want to say that. I'm not an irrationalist. I don't think we have to abandon reason at all. I think we could be totally reasonable in every aspect of life, in fact. That's kind of a more controversial position, but I do think there's an aspect of reason that can touch everything. But in the spirit of reason and rationality, we need to have way, way, way more humility than the people in the 20th century and the 19th century had, thinking that they were like approaching final physics and approaching final knowledge about biology. And this is also the spirit of communism and socialism and central planning, which says, oh, I figured out how economics works, and so now I can centrally plan all aspects of an economy because we're just that smart. And it turns out the more you learn, the more that's just arrogant and preposterous. And so you need things like freedom and humility, which sound less impressive than, sound less culturally impressive than like I actually don't know how the world works, and so we're just going to allow nature to operate without our control over it or attempt to dominate it. We're not going to figure out how to do immunity better than our immune system, for example. Yes, it's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it.
One of the things that working inside of academia offers you is a very set structure by which to assess and evaluate your goals, your progress, your success therein. There's a very, very clear-cut set of metrics that you are working within. When you divorce yourself from that and you're doing work that is in some ways very abstract, you can't touch philosophy. You can't look at it and measure it and go, okay, this is 6 inches bigger than it was last week. We're making forward progress. How do you think about the progress of your own work, whether or not you're doing the right things or if you're moving in the right direction? How do you think about this?
Yeah, well, I thought a lot about this. One 20th century idea is to try to quantify everything. And that turns out to fail because reality is too complex. So I'm not actually a metric guy. Specifically, I've thought a lot about this question because the new industry of the production of ideas is going to be structured differently than the old one. And we have to try to figure out what progress looks like. And the best I can come up with is that there have to be individuals using their judgment at the head of organizations that determine whether or not the quality of what they're putting out is high quality or not. So in my case with the Natural Philosophy Institute, what I'm going to try to do is not only am I assembling this big list of Dark Age ideas, I want to go through and write accessible articles about the subjects. I want to vet the content. And at the end of the day, when we produce articles or videos or documentaries or podcasts or whatever it is, I want to be the person making the final judgment call to say, is this good or not? And if it meets my standards, which are abstract, at my own personal abstract criteria of whether or not I think this qualifies as a good piece of content, that's I think the way to do it. And then that way you can have different organizations that are going to have different standards. Some people are going to try to make more of a real world impact. Some people, like in my case, whenever I do the take on Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the philosophy of mathematics, whether or not we do a good job is whether or not I determine it's a good, we have respected the ideas and we have respected our audience by trying to communicate clearly about these concepts. That's the best I can come up with right now, but I'm open to all ideas here because that's another really hard one.
Can we talk just a little bit about the institute that you're launching?
Yeah, sure.
What is, how it's going to be structured, what it is, what it's about, where people can find more?
Yeah. Sure. So it's called the Natural Philosophy Institute, and I was going to release it, I think, a year ago, but the book. So this book, this is actually my library copy. I went to see if the library had it. I got them to pick it up.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so
got to pump up those circulation
exactly. So
you should sign it and then send it back.
I am going to do that. I'm not going to tell.
I don't know if that's the face of a library book, but you totally should.
So I'm going to keep it intentionally ambiguous. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to put it in their deposit box outside, and they'll be like, I don't know. So I don't have to interact with anybody. We'll just have to. So. Anyway, so I wrote the book and I had been working on it for a little while. And the idea was that I finished the book and then I launched the Natural Philosophy Institute. But what happened is it did very well at the beginning and a bunch of people wanted it translated. And the author, Roger Ver, also wanted it translated. So we're working on 6 different translations right now that I'm managing this project to get that taken care of, hopefully by the end of the year. And so it turns out this is a good use of my time to totally try to finish that project before I release the Natural Philosophy Institute and make that my main focus. But yeah, the idea is not just this Dark Age list where people can go and they might be interested in seeing just how many paradigms there are, there are reasonable. There are reasons to question a bunch of different paradigms, so that's interesting. What I want to do is try to assemble a list of researchers I can assign to particular rabbit holes, or if somebody has a bunch of knowledge and they're interested in something. For example, one of the guys that has helped me create the website, also a Praxisian, or Praxite, what do you guys call? Praxian, okay. A Praxian is really interested in whether or not the speed of light is actually a universal constant, or whether or not this is just treated as an axiomatic assumption, and is there empirical evidence that the speed of light varies? Interesting subject. But if that's something that an individual is interested in, I want to try to work with those people to help them dive deep into the rabbit hole so they can be the person who has mastered that one thing. So I think this could be really valuable for generating a bunch of high quality content. Also, what I want to do is build an actual community. So the way that we've got it structured, it's going to be a paid network where it's I'm not exactly sure what the price will be, probably somewhere around $20 a month, where you can access, like, it's sort of like a internal social media, like a private community. I don't know if you're familiar with Mighty Networks. There's a few big names that have used it for different projects. I think like Yoga with Adrienne is one of the biggest ones. She's got like 200,000 people in her paid network thing, or maybe more than that now. It's something crazy. And so I'm going to try to use that system to build a community of people that are interested in alternative theories and want to connect with one another to share their ideas. My hope is that if I have some success in creating a community, that I'll be able to select researchers out of that community. So if you've got how many amazing Facebook posts and Twitter posts and Substack articles and blog posts have people written on a bunch of different topics that are now lost into the internet? Like, they're not going to be recovered. They're just a hyperlink somewhere. What I want to do is sort of try to assemble high quality content on this social network and then try to select those articles or individuals and put them on the main website, that we can use their content or their ideas and turn them into like think tank pieces that are high quality. So I think that's another thing that would people might consider valuable and be willing to pay for. Also, I'm going to have lectures on there. This platform, the Mighty Network platform, allows you to sell courses and content in a more traditional, class type setting. So I could do that as well. So that's there are much bigger ambitions in the future, but I'm going to try to do a few things well right now to try to demonstrate this can be done for profit and scale it, and then we'll see about more ambitious projects.
That's really exciting. I'm really stoked to see this go live. If people want to know more about that or read more of your work, where would you send them next?
So you can sign up for the list at natphi.org, natphi.org. And when we go live, you'll get emails there. And then if you're interested in my work, you can check out my website at steve-patterson.com. It'll have a link to my podcast, Patterson in Pursuit, which covers a bunch of stuff. I've got a bunch of articles you can see on that website. I also have a Substack, but it's generally the same content. And a YouTube channel is also linked there as well, where I've done a bunch of different YouTube videos on philosophical topics.
And your website has some really great articles about your own education journey and how you were educated, how you approached your education, how you ended up on this very unorthodox path, which will probably be of great interest to people listening to this.
Yeah.
So I'm going to also plug that. Go check out his About page, check the articles linked there, because there's some really great content about his own education that will probably be very useful to some of you listening to the show. Steve, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you. It has been a pleasure as well. And just as you were saying, I've got a little article on my academic experience. I believe the article that you're referring to that did very well was called "My Bachelor's Degree Means Nothing," something like that. So your audience might enjoy that.
They absolutely will. You should, yeah. If you're listening to this, you should go read that next. It's quite good. Steve, thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Hannah. My pleasure.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.